It's difficult for me to comprehend that the CCA has been in operation for 20 years. It seems simultaneously like yesterday that I worked on the building. I remember any number of steps in the process, but it also seems a lifetime ago. The world was so different then. Things are so different now. To put this the extraordinary achievement of the CCA in some context, I thought that I might say a few words about what things were like before the CCA existed, and a bit about the process of designing and building it, working with Phyllis. I should also mention that though the building opened in 1989, 20 years ago this coming May, Phyllis asked me if I would work on it with her in the early fall of 1983, and she had clearly been thinking about something like the CCA for many, many years before that. So for me, this is the 25th anniversary of my starting to work on this project, and for Phyllis, it is the many, many more than 20-year anniversary of the beginning of the CCA as an idea. What were things like in 1983 when we began our collaboration? It was a time in Quebec that seemed to me very strangely and eerily similar to the times in which we live today, at least from my perspective, a Canadian living in this country to the south, the United States. In that, I remember thinking that the times then were, in economic terms, dire. None of us seemed to have work. We were worried about everything that related to economy. It was a highly politicized time, but it was also a time of great hope and great optimism for the future. As in many cities, Montreal had seen a great number of buildings and neighborhoods destroyed. The site on which the CCA sits was mostly vacant, except for the vandalized, derelict, but landmarked house, the Shaughnessy House at its center. The site looked and felt like a giant hole in the fabric of this quartier, the highway and its 4 on and off ramps having been installed with little attention paid to the consequences for the neighborhood. So, in an important way, the CCA began as an act of conservation, an act of will on Phyllis's part at the beginning in the purchase of the property to stem the tide of loss of significant pieces of the city, and an anticipation of, at that time, unknown better futures ahead. In the beginning of the making of the CCA, in light of this particular set of conditions, Phyllis and I talked also about the CCA being, among many other things, an urban repair. When we began the CCA, we were, I remember being asked in endless numbers of questions, but the most common one was, what is the Canadian Centre for Architecture? And I remember giving many answers, usually not with much effect. People's eyes would glaze over, but the best one was that it was some kind of an architectural museum. And then people would ask, what's an architectural museum? And the conversation would taper off. But the fact is that the CCA was the invention of a new institutional type. There were libraries, for sure, Avery and RIBA among them, 2 great ones. There were various collections of drawings. There were collections of photographs, spaces for exhibition, mostly in architecture schools, and places of research, for sure. But there was no one place where you could gather these activities and facilities in one institution, strangely, because it seems now so important, but there were none. So, in essence, we were in uncharted territory, and that was very exciting and very made things from time to time quite difficult, and things were constantly changing. For one thing, the program was constantly changing. When we began the project in 1983, the CCA, if I recall correctly, had a staff of about 30 or 35 people. When the building opened in 1989, the staff was about 120. We were designing and building during that period, and as these changes came, we hoped that our thinking was was able to anticipate these things. What was it like working with Phyllis? It was certainly demanding. It was exciting, sometimes nervous-making, always fascinating. I remember one anecdote I thought that I would pass on. We'd done the building but not yet thought about the furniture, began designing furniture, and one of the fundamental pieces of this place was this, there's a slide coming that will be perfectly timed, was the making of tables. I was a young architect. Furniture was had been over the horizon, though I'd thought about it, looked at furniture a lot. And with a lot of effort, energy, research, thinking, I designed a table and built this some people in my office built this fabulous model, and I carried it into Phyllis's office. I should say we met every week, at least, sometimes more than once a week, in my office, in Phyllis's office, on the site. And in one of these meetings, I brought the model of this table I'd worried so much about and worked so hard on, put it on a table in Phyllis's office and waited for a moment. And Phyllis uncharacteristically said nothing for a while. And then she said, "Tell me, Peter, what do you think this table does for the advancement of the art of table design?" I picked my table up and I walked out, and I came back a few weeks later, and thus began one of many, many discussions about either using things if they were out there and available and worked well, or advancing the state of the art. A few of the things that I think we achieved at the CCA, we did make, I think, a significant and strategic urban repair, that we visually and psychologically repositioned this quartier and the highway and consolidated a critical edge of a previously badly damaged quartier. We created a stable environment for a very valuable but very fragile set of collections of works on paper, and spaces to exhibit them in that had daylight, which had not been done before, galleries for works on paper, which are so susceptible to the negative aspects of daylight. Those galleries had all been in the artificially light completely. But these were the only galleries the CCA was to have, so that we made them, we figured out a way to bring daylight in for the human spirit without it having a negative effect on the works. An achievement that took a significant amount of effort. We used limestone for the first time in decades, and rescued, I think, an important material, one of the essential materials that defines this city. And we created an institution that was very much about the architecture defined broadly and connected to the world beyond, but also an institution that affirmed its sense of place in this milieu. It was deeply rooted in and committed to this place, a place, I should say, that felt very fragile back then. And in this regard, we used to say that it began and was about native species, starting with Phyllis and me. Other native species being limestone, maple, granite, aluminum, so on. I realized that the real question being asked of me by friends and colleagues and others about the CCA was the question, and the question that the CCA both asks and answers by its very existence is, what is architecture? And a very elusive question, but I would say, in my experience, architecture is about the city. It includes buildings, landscapes, infrastructures. It is cultural, social, political, economic. It's enormously multidisciplinary at the intersection of art, science, history, politics, everything. It's a physical realm that is far more than physical. It is stage and mirror. It's the stage in which we play out our lives. It's the mirror that reflects the quality of those lives. It has an impact on everything short-term and long-term. And as we move forward in this ever-shrinking, fragile world, it's an institution that seems ever more critical as a place that can study ways of being intelligent and civilized as we try and survive another century or a millennium. I cannot say enough about how valuable the CCA is to me, ever more valuable as I look at it from a distance. This is me as an architect and as a thinker speaking, not as having been the architect of it. It's ever more valuable, tremendously valuable to institutions like Harvard and Yale, and I think increasingly valuable as we try and think about making sustainable cities and a sustainable world. Thank you very much, Phyllis, for the opportunity of having worked on it. Thank you.